Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Again, welcome to the Washington Policy Pulse. My name is Nathan Dean. I'm a senior policy analyst here in Bloomberg Intelligence, Washington, D.C. Bureau. We've got a lot of stuff going on this week, and I'm going to start with President Trump's One Big Beautiful Bill. So, yesterday evening, we saw the House Budget Committee advance the One Big Beautiful Bill. The language was the same that we had seen last week. The text was the same as we saw last week. But in order for the four holdouts that were on the committee, and they voted present, they didn't vote aye in favor, they voted present. In order for it, Speaker Johnson had to make a few negotiations and a few promises, and I'm just going to give you the highlights of what those promises were. Now, first off is on the Medicaid side. The way that the bill was written is that there were Medicaid cuts. They weren't going to take place until 2029. Under the promises that Speaker Johnson has given to those holdouts, that the Medicaid cuts would be pushed forward, and they would begin they would begin in 2026. And so obviously that would increase the time frame when those Medicaid cuts. On the Inflation Reduction Act, well, for many of the wind and solar tax credits, they weren't going to be originally, it was going to be phased out in 2032. For solar, for example, the phase out would now be zero in 2031. Under the promises, the Inflation Reduction Act phase out would begin in 2029. On the SALT deduction, well, this wasn't exactly part of the negotiations with the House Budget Committee, but because we have a lot of New Yorkers on the call, I always give the SALT update. The text remains at 30,000. There's a general feeling that the individual is now going to be 40,000 and where it's going to be 80,000 for couples that are filing together. But I would also state that there has been no offer, at least according to the SALT caucus, there's been no official offer from leadership on what the SALT deduction would look like. But again, we anticipate the SALT deduction would go up. And then the final thing was in part of the House Budget Committee cuts is that the FMAP changes through Medicaid. This is how they calculate it. This was considered a red line by many in the moderate space. I guess Speaker Johnson has agreed to look at those changes again. So now that Speaker Johnson, quote unquote, has agreed to it, and I guess there is some disagreement of whether these were verbal promises or on paper. Representative Normer, for example, is saying that they were on paper. Everybody else is saying that they're verbal. But now that Speaker Johnson has agreed to it, what happens now? Well, the House Rules Committee is the next one that actually takes up this process. Representative Chip Roy, who is one of the four holdouts, he also has a vote on that committee. There's one other member that also has a vote on that committee. They are going to meet Wednesday at 1 a.m. Eastern. Obviously, you heard me right, 1 a.m. Eastern. I will not be awake for it. I will get the replay when I wake up in the morning. But that shows you how quickly Speaker Johnson is trying to get this done before Memorial Day. Before this weekend, because the House and the Senate are both scheduled to go on recess this weekend. Speaker Johnson has said, or at least hinted, that they may keep individuals in town over the weekend to get this done. I wouldn't be surprised if the House sticks around all next week, if possible, but they're going to meet at 1 a.m. Wednesday, and I presume it's going to be a very similar indication of where last night's vote was. Lots of promises, and with the idea that Speaker Johnson essentially says to his members, look, we're just trying to advance the legislation here. We're just trying to get the momentum to keep going, but ultimately someday they are going to have to make difficult choices. And I think that's going to continue I don't think that's going to happen until they get to the full floor House vote. Which, obviously if they go really quickly, it could be Friday. But I don't think that they are going to get the votes because remember, for those four changes that Speaker Johnson just agreed to, for example, Medicaid, you got a Republican who's saying don't touch Medicaid. You have President Trump who's saying don't touch Medicaid. For the Inflation Reduction Act, speeding up the tax credits, well, you've got 21 House Republicans saying don't touch the IRA. For the SALT deduction, if they remain hard at 30,000, Representative Mike Lawler has already said he's going to vote no, and you can only afford to lose 3. So where I'm going with this is that I think that the House Rules Committee will probably advance Wednesday, and then they'll get to the full floor House vote. That's when things are going to get interesting. And for this to advance to the Senate, President Trump is most likely going to have to get involved because I don't think the House is going to be able to agree on Medicaid changes, for example, until President Trump comes in and says, look, we are going to do this. This is my goal on Medicaid. We're not going to touch this. We're going to move forward. But again, please remember, this is a very evolving bill. I think the Senate is most likely going to jam up the House. I've said this before and I'll say it again, that they're going to go through all this headache. It's going to pass the House. It will go to the Senate. Then the Senate will jam it up. And we still think that our best case scenario right now is that this passes in the late July timeframe. I still think because the debt ceiling is involved, and I believe that because of this momentum that Speaker Johnson is going through, there's enough time to get it done before then. So that's what's going on with the one big beautiful bill. Now, next thing I want to talk about is we've talked about it on this call before is the Genius Act. This is that stablecoin bill. Now, it is Senator John Thune has filed another cloture vote on this. This is the vote to advance to the other legislation. We could see that vote happen as soon as tonight. If you remember, the vote failed last week, and there was a lot of negotiations between Senator Senator Mark Warner from Virginia, Senator Ruben Gallegos from Arizona, and Mark Warner even just announced yesterday that he's now going to vote in favor of this bill. Now, the legislative text honestly didn't change all that much. For the folks that are on this call, there was some AML language, some tightening of foreign controls. It didn't change all that much. So both sides negotiated. I think this bill passes tonight. I think it passes the Senate maybe tomorrow. Remember, a cloture vote versus a full vote. The timing is still be determined, but I think it passes the Senate later today or tomorrow, and then it goes to the House. And I think the House will eventually pick this up sometime in the late June timeframe, maybe July timeframe. But I do think this is eventually going to become law. A couple other things going on is some news that's Bloomberg News is Lydia Baird broke over at the SEC. It has been reported that the SEC is now looking at rules to invest in private funds. And I'm just going to read from the article. SEC Chairman Paul Atkins has said that he will ask agency staff to consider revising 23-year-old rules for private funds that require investments by closed-end mutual fund investors of at least $25,000 and restrict sales to those who meet certain standards. So, if you remember, we've talked about the SEC chairman before, we've talked crypto, and we've talked capital formation. Now, capital formation, there was always this thought that they would change the accredited investor definition. I still think that's in the cards, but this is probably the first opening salvo. Now, when Atkins says that he's directed staff to look into it, in my mind, that means that the proposal is not ready. So you could see a proposal sometime by the end of this year, maybe the beginning of this year, but we'll see. Also, in the same article, it was reported that Atkins was going to look at this thing called the Consolidated Audit Trail, known as the CAT. If you're in the exchange spaces, you know what this is. All I'm going to say here is that if you're interested in the CAT, we have a market structure team, Larry Tabb, Jackson Goodapan, Brian Meehan, for example. They can talk to you about the Consolidated Audit Trail. So just contact me and I'll put you in touch with them. So it's one of those more technical things that I don't write about all that much. And then the last two things I want to talk about, we have lots of appropriation hearings going on this week with lots of testimonies about the budget. There were more individuals from the Trump cabinet who are testifying this week than I even wanted to write out. My whole point here is the budget requests, the Appropriations Committee stay fairly centered on appropriations. Sometimes you get into a committee hearing and they'll say, okay, this committee hearing is about fixed income, and then a congressman comes in and says, well, what do you think of balloons? That doesn't usually happen in appropriations. So just keep in mind that you're going to see a lot of Trump officials testifying this week. I don't think you're going to see much in the way of policy changes or statements or anything like that. And then the last hearing that I want to call out is going to happen tomorrow at 10 a.m. This is the Senate Finance Committee. This is for those of you in the tax space. IRS nominee Billy Long will be testifying. Certainly there's some interesting questions here, but I'm mostly interested in these tax credits tied to this one big beautiful bill, tied to the Inflation Reduction Act. Because if you remember, when it comes to these tax provisions, the one big beautiful bill is written in a way for Congress to understand, but it needs Treasury Department, it needs the IRS to actually go forth and implement these tax regulations, and that takes time. And I want to hear from candidate Long on exactly what his areas of focus will be. So we're going to be paying attention to that. So with that, I'm going to stop here. I'm going to just talk for another 30 seconds to give individuals the time to put in any questions you may have. But again, thank you very much for calling, or thank you very much for attending. We really appreciate it. And if we can ever be of service, please let us know. Please note, we will not be having this call next week on Monday. If you get an email on Tuesday, I can't remember if we scheduled one on Tuesday. If you get a reminder on Tuesday saying we're going to have the call, then we'll have the call because I will get the same reminder and I'll be working on Tuesday. But otherwise, I wish you a wonderful long weekend, and I say thank you very much again for attending. Thank you.